Well, Commandant, Sylvia, and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me tonight to welcome here Sir Hugh Dundas, who is undoubtedly one of the great wartime fighter pilots. But also of interest is that he went on to have a great success in his civilian life afterwards as well. And what I'd like to do as way of an introduction, sir, is just provide a few outline details, because I'm sure Sir Hugh will not go into all the details that I will give you.
Do you have to?
I have to, sir. Yes. I've done a lot of reading for this introduction, so I'm going to. Sir Hugh joined 616 Auxiliary Squadron in May 1939, and he very quickly received the nickname Cocky Dundas. And I'm sure at some time, if you ask him the question, he will explain why. It's an interesting story in itself, how he received that name. He flew during the Dunkirk evacuations, and then in August 1940, he was shot down by an ME-109, which was the first time of a series, not too many, when he was either shot down or badly destroyed in his aircraft by enemy fire. He was involved in the Battle of Britain, but in his book, which I'll mention later on, he does make some very apposite points about the Battle of Britain and his involvement in that. And he joined BARDA's Big Wing concept in September of the same year. I mentioned a few weeks ago when Group Captain Cheshire was here how quickly he moved through the system, and Sir Hugh Dundas moved through the system equally quickly. By the age of 21, he was a flight commander and had received the DFC. At 22 and 4 months, he was promoted to wing commander to take over flying Typhoons. And then in early 1943, he was posted to North Africa and then back onto Spitfires. And then with the great thrust forward at that time of the war, there was a fairly quick leap to Malta, Sicily, and then onto mainland Italy. And then at the age of only 24 and 3 months, he was promoted to group captain. He received a DSO in 1944 and a bar in 1945. Now, Sir Hugh was deliberately said to me he would like to speak tonight for 20 to 25 minutes only, and then he would like to open it up to you as the audience to ask questions or enter discussion as well. So after 20 to 25 minutes, we'll take a couple of minute break, and then it's very much up to you to come back to Sir Hugh and question whatever you wish to do on this. Sir, it's a delight to see you here tonight, and we look forward to hearing what you've got to say.
Thank you very much. Very inventive. Well, there's one thing which I take comfort in this position, that is that I didn't ask to be here. And unlike the bishop. And although this has really got nothing to do with what I've come here to talk to you about, I'll just tell you about the bishop because you might find it useful on future occasions. This stupid bishop rather liked talking to people, and he decided that he would make an expedition, spend a week going round some of his outlying parishes and preaching a sermon at each one of them as he went. And he was rather disappointed to find that the congregation seemed to be getting smaller and smaller as he went around, until the very last night there was practically nobody there at all. And he could no longer really swallow his indignation, and as he was leaving the church, he said to the church warden, he said, "Didn't you tell them I was going to be here?" And the church warden said, "No, I didn't, but I'm bloody well going to find out who did." Well, at least I can't be blamed on that basis. Leadership in war, that's the subject which I've been asked to talk about. And it is a very elusive subject. And yet it is, I think, the subject which lies at the very core of your profession as officers in the Royal Air Force. It's surprising and flattering to me that you should have called upon an ancient relic such as myself to come and discuss it with you this evening. Although I dare say that we shall decide as the discussion continues, that the qualities which make for distinguished leadership in war are the same today as they were 100 years ago, or even, if you like, 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. Wing Commander Chisnall was very specific in telling me that I was requested and required in addressing this subject to draw upon personal reminiscence. In so doing, I shall therefore simply be obeying orders for once. But I must emphasize in advance that this should not be construed as constituting any claim on my part to be considered as a competent practitioner of the subject in question. Far from it. Towards the end of 1946, I found myself in the old adastral house at the bottom of Kingsway, face to face with a wing commander in the AMP's department. I had just returned to this country from Italy, having at last and with much sadness separated myself from my beloved 244 wing, which I had led since May 1944 and commanded since October of that year. The aforementioned wing commander, on the other side of the desk, whose original provenance, as I later discovered, had been the Provost General's department, gave a very clear impression of disapproval and even distaste for what he was seeing in my career file, and also, quite evidently, for the person who actually sat before him, recognizably, though no doubt somewhat eccentrically to his eyes anyway, uniformed as a group captain. He concluded his opening remarks, which had not been intended to be friendly, with words to the effect that the time had now come when I should know that an officer in the Royal Air Force had more important things to do, and in my case, to learn, than flying around in aeroplanes fighting the enemy. He was absolutely wrong, of course, though perhaps it was also wrong of me to have told him so in quite such trenchant terms. It was his office, after all. But he was quite wrong. The fact is that the Royal Air Force has, au fond, no other purpose than to fight the enemy. And the ultimate objective of every officer must or should be to train and prepare himself or herself to do so in the role of leader should the need arise. My own career in service, brief as it was, June 1939 to the end of 1947, the beginning of 1947, was concerned almost exclusively with that core subject and activity. Of course, I was not playing any sort of a leadership role in the early stages of that career, though the opportunity to begin to do so did come along fairly early on, as I found myself appointed to command a flight on or about my 21st birthday, the squadron some 5 months later, and to lead a wing 11 months after that. The only times when I was not engaged in service with squadrons or wings in an operational role were 3 weeks in the autumn of 1941 spent as an instructor at a fighter OTU in Cumberland, and 4 months as GTI fighters on Harry Broadhurst's staff in Italy in early 1944, an appointment which in any case involved me in spending most of my time in the cockpit of a Spitfire, as also did my AOC. Inevitably, in the course of this misspent youth, as some would probably describe it, and as my old friend the wing commander in the AMP's department most certainly did, I had ample opportunity to observe the art of leadership in war and to recognize the genuine article when I saw it. War. It is not an occupation, you would think, which a man would wish to dwell upon too much when he has no professional need or obligation to do so. and yet it is a haunting subject. 46 years have passed since I personally was involved in war, and during all that time I seem to have been exceedingly busy and preoccupied with other things. I think I can honestly say that it has been my habit to look forward and not backwards. I've been lucky, and I've enjoyed a full life and a fulfilling career. When I left industry, I was running a business which employed 100,000 people, so I knew a little bit about command in the other side of life from the service. And yet the memory of war, the personal experience of war all those years ago, never has gone away, and I'm sure never will. It remains for me, and I think for many of my contemporaries, a vitally important, if not a dominating factor in life. Although I have, so to speak, locked it away in a kind of secret room, a room of memory, a room to be visited privately and only occasionally, it is never quite or even nearly forgotten. Leadership in war. It is indeed, as I've already said, an elusive quality, easy enough to recognize when you have once seen it in action, but by no means easy to define or describe. The first thing to be said about it, perhaps, is that it is not a professional quality which can be taught or learned in the ordinary manner of teaching and learning. Here, for instance, at Staff College, it is quite properly a subject for consideration and discussion. But that cannot result in anyone learning here how to do it. I believe that the only way in which it can be passed on is by personal demonstration on the one hand and personal observation on the other. A great wartime leader doesn't tell people what to do, he shows them what to do. I became personally aware of this phenomenon through my association with Douglas Bader. I first met him in September 1940 and later lived and flew with him through the somewhat hectic spring and summer of 1941. I have described my relationship with Bader and its effect on me in my book. So what I am now going to say will be familiar to the one or two of you who may actually have waded through it. And you should therefore feel free to spend the next 3 or 4 minutes wondering what's going to win the derby or in some other such gainful occupation. Douglas Bader came into my life at a critical moment. I had just got back to my squadron after being comprehensively and very frighteningly shot down. And the squadron to which I had returned, the same one as I had joined some 16 months earlier as a starry-eyed 18-year-old pupil pilot, was more or less unrecognizable, well over half of the pilots having, during the 3 weeks of my absence, fallen victim in one way or another to the Battle of Britain. Now, ostensibly reformed, we were about to go into action again with the Duxford Wing, led by squadron leader Douglas Bader. The atmosphere that morning in the Nissen hut allocated to us at our dispersal point on the perimeter of Falmere, the satellite airfield a few miles west of Duxford, could probably best be described as queasy. I personally was just straightforward frightened, indeed terrified to the bone by the prospect of another encounter with the Luftwaffe, such as my last one had been. No doubt I was doing my best to disguise its fact, but so far from itching to be up and at them, I was silently praying with an intensity which had done credit to the best of your medieval mystics that there would be no action for Dundas that day. Well, that extreme form of sickness was to a great extent alleviated, if not altogether cured, I think in fact it never was, by the appearance and presence of Douglas Bader. He stomped into the hut and he wrought his magic. He lifted our spirits. He made us want to follow him into the hostile sky. He somehow showed us how he felt about it all and made us want to feel the same. He didn't tell us, he showed us. Although we only flew a few times late that September in the dying phase of the battle as part of the Bader wing, it was enough to open my eyes, at least, to the meaning of leadership, though I do not suppose that I thought of it or analysed it in those terms at the time. And the process was continued at much greater length and at much closer quarters the following spring and summer, when Bader was leading the Tangmere wing and, having elected to keep his Spitfire with our squadron, elected also to have me fly beside him on every sortie. We crossed over to France together at the sharp end of the wing more than 60 times between mid-May and mid-August, when he went down near Saint-Omer. It was hard slogging, and there was a steady drain of pilots and aircraft shot down or damaged to the extent that they couldn't make it back across the channel. In one period of only 21 days, our squadron lost 12 pilots, more than half of our full establishment, and things were no different in the other two squadrons of the wing. And yet spirit and morale were sky high, buoyed up and sustained by the behaviour and example of the man who led us. I wish I could tell you how he did it, and then you could all go out and do the same. I cannot, of course, but I can give you some of the attributes. He was brave, no doubt about that, and visibly, demonstratively so. Yet he was very far from being reckless. He demanded commitment to the fight from individuals and units alike, and yet he was understanding of others less robust in spirit and nature than himself, putting a metaphorical arm around them and helping them to go forward with him. He drove himself tirelessly, yet he kept a wise and constant eye on others to ensure that they were not driven beyond the tolerable frontiers of their own endurance. He could and did admit you into his personal friendship, and yet he succeeded always in maintaining that invisible barrier which must in some way set aside the commander from those he commands. From my worm-like position as a 20-year-old pilot officer, and then flying officer, and then flight commander, I was able to observe him closely, and he showed me how a man should behave when at war, and what the word leadership truly meant. For nearly 4 years thereafter, as the campaigns came and went, I had his example always before me. Well, that's all very well, I hear you say, but why can you not describe to us exactly how he did it? And I have to repeat that I cannot do so in precise and analytical terms. I've already mentioned some of the characteristics which he and others with similar gifts of leadership in war possessed. Courage, obvious commitment to the fight and to victory, tirelessness, keeping going, continuing to fight when others feel that they have had and have done enough and want to call it a day, understanding of the fears and weaknesses of others and the ability to inspire them to overcome such weakness and fear, and that includes demonstrating very publicly and again and again and again that you are always willing to do anything which you ask of others. I think those are the main components, and I think that the single most indispensable factor is courage. For while courage in itself is not enough, or even nearly enough, No other fine attributes or combination of them will carry you through if you lack courage. War, when you get down to the final analysis, is a nasty business involving basically killing and being killed. I suppose that there is the occasional freak who, having once seen for himself at first hand and at close quarters what is involved in the sharp end of war, still feels no fear. But such a condition is truly freakish and must be very rare. And so courage, true courage, involves overcoming and subordinating fear. That is what most people most ardently wish to be able to do when faced with battle. That is what, in their heart of hearts, they find most difficult, and that is what they most want to be shown how to do by their leaders. I've known several men who have had that capacity in varying degrees. They have not generally been the kind of men who win Victoria Crosses. The astonishing supreme act of heroism which wins that award is often a one-off, like a meteor's swift flight and passing. But a notable leader in war has to be able to show courage continuously through long periods of hard slogging and danger. It is the one characteristic which, it seems to me, is shared by all who, historically, shine out as supremely good wartime leaders. Alexander the Great and the Duke of Wellington, Sir Francis Drake and Lord Nelson, General Adolphe Galland and Group Captain Leonard Cheshire. Their leadership was displayed in different ways. Alexander, for instance, was flamboyant in battle, always and deliberately conspicuous in dress and behavior, while Wellington, by contrast, dressed down, seldom drawing a sword or carrying a pistol. Yet his calm and commanding presence was to be seen, his clear, concise orders to be heard hour after hour in the thick of the battle, always giving his attention and his personal leadership where affairs were most critical and action hottest, apparently impervious to the awful carnage all around him as the musket and cannonballs tore into man and horse alike. The Duke was in the saddle and in the midst of things for some 17 hours at Waterloo, where by nightfall the field of battle was literally covered with 40,000 men dead or dying and 10,000 horses in like condition. And when at last, after riding back to his billet in the village and sharing some supper with one of his officers, the time came when he could rest, he lay down fully clothed on a couch. He had given up his bed to a friend and a member of his staff, Colonel Alexander Gordon, who now lay upon it dying from his wounds, which included an amputated leg. One wonders, does one not, what the television networks would have made of all that. And that, incidentally, is a question which I seriously believe bears upon the subject of this evening's discussion. As I watched the output of the television networks during the unfolding of the Gulf War, when, happily only occasionally, an Allied plane was lost or some minor setback was reported with such apparent anxiety and wringing of hands, I couldn't help wondering how the conduct of war would in future be affected for leaders and led alike by such constant and total exposure. My mind went back 45 years to the culminating phase of the Italian campaign, and I wondered how on earth we would have managed if the whole thing had been on TV. My wing of 5 Spitfire fighter bomber squadrons was engaged then, as it had been for several months, in providing close support for the advancing 8th and 5th Armies and for disrupting the enemy's lines of communications to the rear. In the 17 days, when the final assault was at its height, from the crossing of the Senio River up to the Alps, 244 Wing flew 3,661 operational sorties, dropped 851 tons of bombs, fired off 345,380 rounds of cannon shells, and 804,291 rounds of 804,291 rounds of machine gun ammunition. Coming up at us in the opposite direction, anti-aircraft fire resulted in 55 of our aircraft being destroyed or damaged so badly as to be beyond repair. 41 more were so badly damaged that they could not be repaired within the wing's own facilities, and another 31 were hit. 9 pilots were killed, 3 more were missing, and several others had bailed out or crash-landed but were known to be safe. One shudders to think what today's electronic media would have made of that too. Be that as it may, it was the final cataclysmic phase of a period of action which certainly provided me personally with the most serious challenge of my own wartime career in the business of leadership. The wing had been converted from air-to-air fighting duties soon after the fall of Rome the previous summer to give close support to the advancing Allied armies, the 8th Army in particular. The battle with the Gothic line had just then, and from that moment on, our enemy had been the random but lethal one of flak, applied in large daily doses. During those long months, not much less than a year, I felt and discerned to a far greater extent than I ever had during the years of mainly air fighting, the corrupting, insidious influence of fear among the young pilots in the squadrons. I described it in my book in these words. I quote, "I watched the faces of the pilots in the briefing tent as the Army liaison officers and operations officers explained the details of their tasks before takeoff. Every man knew that within half an hour he would be facing the flak, quite unable to defend himself against it. When you said good luck to a pilot going off on one of those missions, that was literally what you meant. Good luck. That was your hope. That was what you clung to. With good luck, you would get through the barrage unscathed. With only a bit of luck, you would sustain a hit but would still be able to fly home. With bad luck, you would be forced to bail out or to crash land. With no luck at all, you would be killed." It was not surprising that I often saw fear in the eyes of those young men as they listened to the briefing. It is not surprising that from time to time some would find it almost impossible to control that fear. And that's the end of the quotation. It was perhaps the classic situation, replicated many thousands of times in different forms and different spheres of activity, where men looked to those immediately above them for support and inspiration. The quality of a particular squadron in doing this work depended crucially on the quality of its commanding officer and its flight commanders. The flight commanders, of course, looked to the squadron commanders, and the squadron commanders looked to the wing leader and the group captain. During all of those long months, I was in effect wing leader as well as from October to May wing commanding officer. For it so happened that for some weeks after I'd been promoted to command on my predecessor's return to England, I was provided with no replacement wing leader. And only 2 or 3 weeks after one arrived, he left again. And then when at last another replacement took over, he very soon fell victim to the flak and was killed. And so it was on me that the watching eyes were focused. And it was then that I learned in practice and in the hardest school, and in a way which I had never experienced before, not only how vitally necessary it is in such circumstances to provide what those you lead are looking for, but also how agonizingly difficult it can be to do so when there is no one else there to make you do it, when you are very young and very tired and very frightened and feel that you have, over a period of several years, already survived enough. I do not for a moment claim that I did it, but I do say that I recognized very clearly then what needed to be done and why. I learned what are the required qualities, however limited my own ability to supply them. And so I will end these introductory remarks by repeating them. First, courage. That is to say, the ability to suppress one's own fear and to help others to do the same. Then, clear commitment to the fight and to victory. Tirelessness, keeping going when others would call it a day, the long, hard slog. Understanding, but never condoning, the weaknesses of others, giving them somehow the strength to overcome them, giving them also your friendship, while still maintaining the aura of authority and command. Sounds simple enough, doesn't it? But it's rare, very rare, and in your profession, infinitely precious. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Plenty of food for thought there. Can you just take a 2-minute leg stretch and recharge your glasses if you need to, and then we'll go straight into questions.
Right.
If I can start, thank you for an absolutely incredible chat. I think we all believe that you've already just passed your talk 1 and talk 2 here at the Staff College on Bracknell. But one of the things that I think you alluded to a lot of it, in fact, during your talk, but one of the things that's still not quite, I'm sure about in my mind, is that after the completion of the war, there were so many senior officers that very quickly left. Was there sort of an exit stage left? Did they believe, like yourself, that really you'd run such a risky game for such a long time that you felt that it was time to go to pastures new? Or was it that, from the point of view that the future of the Air Force at the time was so uncertain that you'd made your mind that you really did want to find something new?
Well, I can only speak for myself, although obviously I know a little bit about what other people did. But you have to remember the background was that the Royal Air Force had expanded very, very fast indeed. It was a very large force indeed at the end of the war, and there were a lot of people who'd risen up quite a long way. And I think that when the war ended, a lot of them who might have thought that they wanted to stay with the service really just decided that they didn't want to. It wasn't their lives. It never had really been their lives. It had been a wartime part of their lives. So far as I was concerned, I mean, I left really for all the wrong reasons. It was partly that bloody wing commander, you know,
that's the right reason.
who sort of cheesed me off quite considerably, and I'm not at all proud of my decision to leave, and dear old Jack Slessor, God bless him, tried very hard indeed to persuade me not to, but I just sort of felt I wanted to go and do something else, which was a ridiculous thing to do when I was still only 25 and had the whole thing at my feet. I don't think there was any logic to it, and I'm afraid that the same would have applied to a lot of people, remembering that we'd spent 6 years living in a thoroughly unnatural and illogical way, really, and a lot of us just wanted to go and do something else, I think. I mean, that's a frightfully unsatisfactory answer, I'm sorry.
No, it was just that at the time there clearly was a very, very big void. And it was almost as though all the good guys left. And it was quite a period then before. I don't mean quite this, but as I say, but there was a big void. So clearly around time again before the system started to get itself working.
Well, I wouldn't say all the good guys left by any means. There were a lot of very good guys who stayed. I don't honestly think, although I've never really put my tiny mind to this particularly, but I don't think there's any sort of pattern or logic to it, really. And I certainly don't think that people left just because they were fed up. Most of the people who left because they hadn't gone in as professionals. It wasn't their career. As far as I was concerned, I mean, I'd gone in as an auxiliary. I was very proud and honoured to be given offered and take a regular commission halfway through the war. And I really thought I would go on. I think there was something to do with a girl in Italy, actually, but we won't go into that.
So Hugh, to continue that thought of the difference between peace and war, what differences would you see between the requirements for leadership in peace and in war?
Well, I think the same qualities in an officer in the service are required in both peace and war. I took the subject of my introductory remarks as being leadership in war because that was what I was told we were going to be talking about. But obviously, I think the subject is wider than that because, thank God, the service goes on during most of the time without a war going on, although, as I say, the only purpose of having the service actually is to be ready to fight a war. But I think that the leader in a service, in the Royal Air Force or the Army or the Navy, needs to have the same qualities. The only thing is that the quality of courage, which I say in a war leader, is absolutely crucial. And that without that, all the other attributes don't work. I mean, don't make you a great leader. I suppose that to some extent in peacetime, it may be possible to fudge that. But courage takes many forms, and it isn't just the form of being brave in the face of the enemy. It's the form of being brave in all kinds of other ways. And somebody who's not got courage actually is usually found out whether there's a war on or not, I think.
So how do you deal with divided loyalties? For example, if you were tasked with an operation you had very bad feelings about, and you were obliged under the chain of command to comply with the orders given, and you may have said your piece to contradict the orders given, but nevertheless they held sway, how did you sell a bad operation to your men?
I don't know. It never happened to me. I mean, perhaps in retrospect there were bad operations, but when I was not sufficiently intelligent to see them in advance, thank God. I'm sorry. It's a serious question, but I can't answer it better because I don't think. I mean, certainly there were and there must have been occasions. In fact, there were occasions, I can think of them, when I didn't think it was right that one should be doing this, that, or the other. But by and large, one sorted that out. I never certainly got to the stage when I was being asked to do something which I thought was wrong from the point of view of the people I was having to take in to do it. So, to that extent, it didn't arise.
Sir, you highlighted the need for stamina as one of the characteristics you thought important. We saw so evidently on television during the Gulf campaign the effects of a very short period of operations, of months or so, and we saw that people were fairly tired at the end of that. But you're talking another time scale again. You're talking not months but years. How did you manage to motivate yourself to keep going for that sort of period? At what's probably quite an intensive rate of flying.
Well, I think there are several answers to that question, or several pieces of answer. In the first place, although I said perhaps rather swankily that throughout the whole period I was with the squadron, so to speak, the squadrons weren't always engaged in battle. I mean, there were quite, for instance, the winters were very often quite down times. We didn't have all weather affairs. We only really flew and operated when the weather was suitable. And there were long periods when we were never in action. And so there were opportunities of resting. But of course there were also laid down periods of operation, X many hours or whatever. And there were just some rather obstinate characters like myself who had perhaps been brought up in the wrong prep school in the rather Victorian atmosphere, who thought it was inappropriate that one should go off and have a rest. And anyway, I was always absolutely terrified of being sent to something like a staff college where my terrible lack of education would be discovered. Thought it was safer to stay where I was. One did get, there were moments, I must say, there were moments in the war when I personally was very, very tired. But I was also very, very young and had a lot of built-in stamina. And to be perfectly honest, I just didn't think that one should stop, really.
I mean, to follow on from that, did you see signs of combat fatigue, for want of a better term, amongst your subordinates?
Yes.
What have you got to be able to deal with that?
Well, I mean, you that was part of the art, wasn't it? There was no point in driving somebody on beyond the stage where he could be driven. And, people could be given a rest, people could be sent off on leave. And this was part of the business of running an organization. You kept an eye on people, see how they were reacting. People might sometimes have some very nasty experiences, and you had to watch them then to help them through them and so on. But if, on the other hand, you had somebody who was just not going to face it, then you had to get him out. And it didn't mean necessarily that he had to be put up against the wall and shot or cashiered or disgraced or anything else. There were probably other useful things that he could do. I mean, there were people like that. But the great thing was to get them out of the way before it was catching.
So can I focus in on a couple of characters? One I've mentioned already in the introduction, Johnny Johnson, and one I haven't mentioned, Broadhurst. Two characters that you talk about in great detail in your book. And the way you reflect, I think, in your book, Johnny Johnson, is as a very natural friend and ally, and a man you drank lots of brandy with, and great drinking sprees with Johnny Johnson. Broadhurst, very different, because he wasn't your most popular officer at one stage of your career, and yet you later grew to admire him and respect him and talk about him with great affection. Now, you've talked about Bardo and what you learned from him and the qualities he had that rubbed off to you. Can you perhaps say a little bit about Johnny Johnson and about Broadhurst, two very different characters who you responded to differently, and what rubbed off on you about them and what you found was interesting about them as leaders?
Well, Johnny, I never really knew as a leader. because we were together from September 1940 until September 1941, and mainly all through the summer of 1941, which was a very hectic summer, really in many ways more hectic than 1940. And we were both boys in the squadron. I mean, we were flying officers and flight lieutenants. I think I'm not sure whether he was a flight lieutenant when I left, but he became one very soon thereafter. But we were absolutely together doing things at that level, and indeed sharing a room and everything else. I kept in touch with him thereafter, and when he was a squadron commander, and so was I. But I never served with him or under him, because quite soon after that I went to the Mediterranean and he stayed here. But Johnny was a larger-than-life person. He was a marvellous fighter pilot. He was a frightfully good shot, apart from anything else. He was a very good shot and is. He's a hard killer with a 12-bore. You know, I mean, he's a real menace to everything that flies, including the Germans. And he was extremely courageous, but at the same time, he was not someone who was unaware of the dangers. But he was evidently a very, very skillful fighter pilot, because I think I was saying to you or to somebody before dinner that I don't believe he was ever hit. Which I may be wrong about that. You must ask him. But I said that I think if he had been, he'd have let me know about it fairly sharply, you know, because he raised his voice fairly loudly when anything terrible happened. But I don't think he was ever hit, which is extraordinary when you think of the fighting that he went through. He must have been frightfully good, and certainly he was absolutely worshipped by the pilots in his wing. I was sent from Italy in sort of closed season in about February 1945, when nothing was happening, with Paddy Green and a South African colonel from Desert Air Force from Italy, on a visit to the second TAF or whatever it was that, you know, Brawley and Cunningham were commanding up in the north. And I spent 2 or 3 nights with Johnny with his wing, and he was looked up to by his pilots to an extraordinary extent. So he was, I don't know, I mean I do know because I knew him, but I can't say firsthand because I wasn't there when he was commanding anything. Brawley had all the attributes really. He did it, and he was a very successful fighter pilot in his own right in 1940. He could fly anything, and he shot down a good many German airplanes, and there was nothing he couldn't do really, and he was much admired and looked up to. He was a very ruthless person, but I discovered that really he was like quite a lot of good commanders I've known, that he really liked to have with him the people whom he knew, and who he knew him and liked him. And my forelight with him really was a stupid one, and he was we quarrelled about how the Typhoon was going to be used, and he was group captain operations at Fighter Command, which is rather more important than I was as commander of 56 Squadron. But he didn't like it much. Particularly, he didn't like it when the C&C suggested that my ideas should be tried out. And when it came to the Desert Air Force and the Tunisian Air Force, the Air Force which had been in Tunisia, coming together and being merged with Brawley as AOC, he wanted his wing leaders to be the people whom he knew. And for that reason, I mean, he was that ruthless, really, that was why he told Barry Cunningham that he didn't want me as one of his wing leaders. But as it happened, he didn't find anybody else, and about 5 weeks later, he came and said to me, after we dealt with Sicily, and my wing had really done quite well, he came along and said all was forgiven, and then he gave me this very personal job on his staff when I had been ill and had actually been sent off to Staff College in Haifa, but had to hurry back to Italy because somebody got killed who was doing this job. I worked very closely with Brodie and we became great friends. Indeed, on his 80th birthday, in a room absolutely stuffed with air marshals, I've never seen so many air marshals, dead and alive, all sitting together in a room. At Brodie's request, I was the man who proposed the toast to his 80th birthday. So, I mean, we ended up from 1944 onwards, or 43 onwards, as the best of friends. And he was totally loyal to you once he knew that you were with him. Now, you can read what you like into that. You might say that he should never have been totally loyal until, whether he knew or not, but I have a great deal of sympathy with him in that.
Sir, a common thread running through some previous discussions we've had of a similar subject, that very many young men have been thrown into a situation of command, having been pilots on the squadron. I'd be interested to know what was the selection procedure in that situation where perhaps the squadron boss has been killed or removed from command for whatever reason, and they feel it necessary to draw a pilot from the squadron. What were the essential qualities that, and who made the decision in that situation?
Well, I can only speak for my own experience here. I don't know what happened in the generality of the Royal Air Force, but so far as Desert Air Force was concerned, and you must remember that Desert Air Force was still Desert Air Force when it was in Austria, so it wasn't really Desert Air Force any longer. It was a very hands-on affair. I mean, my job as GTI fighters was, in fact, to spend all my time visiting and, to some extent, flying with the wings and squadrons of Desert Air Force, talking to the wing COs and the wing commanders, getting to know the squadron commanders, and then discussing with the AOC and his SASO the question of promotions, resting, taking people out, putting other people in, and it was done very much on the spot, on the basis of performance, and the impression which people made on a few mugs like me. Really, I mean, it was a very unfair way of doing it, perhaps, but it seemed to work reasonably well. It was very unstructured. And I mean, for instance, when I was promoted to wing commander, again, if you've read this ridiculous book, I tell the story. It was involved with Johnny Johnson because it was his wretched wedding when he came down to Norfolk, where I'd got a squadron at Matlask near it was a cultural satellite, and I was his best man, and he was marrying a girl in Norwich, and we had the most sort of frightful 2 days of jollification, during the course of which practically all the mode of transport in the squadron got written off one way or another, and the last straw was on the morning after the wedding. I was dragging myself into consciousness when the squadron admin officer, or squadron adjutant, came along and told me that the last remaining bit of transport, which was a sort of standard van or something, had turned upside down the previous night with about 5 WAFs in it and God knows what else. And the thing looked very bad. That morning, John Grandy rang me up from Duxford and said that he'd been told to form the first Typhoon fighter bomber wing, and he'd like me to go as wing commander flying. Would I go? And I said, well, I'd love to, but can you possibly arrange it this afternoon, because this is what's just happened. And I mean, it may sound absolutely ridiculous, but that is, he said, leave it to me, old boy. And the next thing I knew was about 2 hours later, I got a signal before the sort of group admin officer had discovered that we'd destroyed practically every bit of transport in the squadron in moments of drunken fury. And I mean, that's how one tended to get promoted.
I'm not sure, sir, but we stand a good chance.
Can I ask you, carrying on that sort of the attitude, the attitude and that approach to life, and how would you regard such people in your civilian life, in Thames Television, that sort of thing?
Well, Thames Television, it was different. Thames Television was owned by the main company that I ran, and I was both. There was another large company which also had a big shareholding in it, and between the two of us, we always had a certain number of people on the board, and I'd been a member of the board of that from the day of its formation, but very much as a sort of shareholders representative, not running the business, except in my capacity as a member of the board. But therefore, I mean, running a television business is one thing, and it is a technical and an artistic thing, and that was very much done by the managing director under the supervision of the board. But in the other sphere of my activity, of course, theoretically, I would have regarded such a way of doing things as being absolutely suicidal. But the fact of the matter is that people were picked for promotion because of what they did, just as much in industry as in the Royal Air Force. It became perhaps increasingly important in that sphere, as it no doubt is in the Royal Air Force, to pick people with qualifications, because the whole of industry has become more organized in the sense of qualifications and management habits and so on. And if you don't know what everybody else is up to, you don't tend to get eaten up. But basically, there wasn't too much difference. I used to look out for people who made things happen. And then if they'd got the ability to operate as leaders and as managers, that was what I wanted. I didn't want people who were just managers. I wanted leaders and makers of things happening. And isn't that the same in the service, really? I mean, you can get to a certain level by being frightfully good at managing and administering, but then you've got to have the flair.
Excuse me, sir. Reflecting on World War II as a fighter pilot and leader, what was the single most important thing you learned on Paramount from World War II?
Don't go to weddings with Johnny Johnson.
Lock up your transport. Gosh, well, that is a difficult question. I don't know, really. I mean, the important things are eternal. Really, they are loyalty and the ability to work within a team and to lead a team, to put up with the bad things as well as the good things. So, you know, they're all cliches in a way, but they're all true. And I think I would say very much to take the rough with the smooth, to be able to get through the bad times. But then I think that is an absolute fundamental thing in life, really, not just in the Royal Air Force or in anything else. But if you can't get through the bad times, you won't get through life, except in rather a wimpish way. And there's always bad times. Every time you think everything's going well, something comes along and you know, metaphorically, you land with your undercarriage up. It happens in all forms of activity, to my knowledge. But I mean, that's very unsatisfactory to answer to a.
Loyalty is probably what we see today as one of the.
I think loyalty is. I think loyalty is absolutely almost top of the tree, really. Loyalty to one's organisation, but above all to the people with you. But also, you've got to be prepared to be quite tough if you think that the people with you aren't what you want to have with you. You mustn't be over loyal to people if you don't think that they're up to it. And that's a very common weakness, which all of us, and certainly I've suffered from.
So, touching on loyalty for a moment, if I may, reflecting on your time during the war and the number of AOCs that perhaps you would have served under, what sort of profile did they have amongst the squadrons that you served on? And indeed, do you have any reservations about any of those that you served under?
Not really, no. I mean, the early ones were all so far astronomically above one that it was just lovely if they remembered your name and gave you a little pat on the head every now and again. And they did too. I mean, actually, my first AOC was Lee Mallory, and I got to know him quite well. And he was a very nice chap and very human in a way. I mean, I was the lowest form of human life, but he knew me and knew of me and knew what I was, and that, I think that was rather admirable, really, when you think of the time. I was very fond of Sholto Douglas. Although he wasn't my AOC, he was my AOC and C, and he was my AOC and C when I was commanding 56 Squadron and having those great difficulties trying to make the Typhoon work and trying to find out how it could be used. And he was very, very supportive about that. And later on in life, when he went to the Middle East, I remember after the end of the Tunisian campaign, I was asked to fly a Typhoon down. One had been delivered, or two had been delivered to North Africa to take down to the desert to have sort of trials in sandy conditions. And I arrived in Cairo, and 24 hours after I got there, I was on leave, I got a message from the C&C saying he'd heard I was there, and was there anything I wanted, and could he let me have a car and a driver to, you know, and he never forgot one when one had been with him. It was those are the sort of things one remembers about these great men.
It's interesting what you say about Mallory, sir, because he had very bad press with the Americans. They found him very difficult.
Yes, well, he was sort of capable of appearing to be a tiny touch on the pompous side, but in his heart of hearts, I don't think he was.
What about Cunningham, sir? You served, I think, under him, did you not?
Well, hardly. I mean, not recognised, but so he was AOC and C of the Tactical Air Force, which we joined up with when we all met in Tunis, and I knew him a bit, but I didn't have any real experience of him.
Or likewise, I suspect Tedder then.
I knew Tedder quite well after the war, funnily enough, and I liked him too. Remember, after I'd left the Royal Air Force, I went back to the Auxiliary Air Force and was commanding 601 Squadron, which was the London Squadron. We were rather rebellious collection of people, really, and we had a very nice squadron headquarters in London, in Kensington Park Road. We gave a pretty good cocktail party there one night, and Tedder came along there. He was chief of the air staff, and he had a good evening's refreshment, and left without taking his cap. He was in uniform. He had a sort of fore and aft cap, and he left it behind, and his car came back for it, and we filled it up with pennies and shillings, and sent it back to him and said we knew why he'd left it, and and he was full of joy about that. He thought it was frightfully funny, and said it was just sort of paid for the butter for the rest of the week, and thanks very much, and he'd leave it again next time. He was quite a good human sort of character. Sorry, that's not a very important story.
Yeah, but it does show that human side to it.
Yes.
So you obviously had a relationship with, well, you obviously had a view with the people above you, at least a view on it. What was it? What sort of? I mean, when you were having your losses in Italy, and you were obviously fighting a very hard campaign there. How did you find your ground crew? How did they behave? How were they excellent?
Yes. I mean, marvelously. Yes. Everybody was working jolly hard, as you can imagine. I mean, those moments when we were flying like we were during that last sort of cataclysmic 3 weeks, everybody was at it from dawn till dusk, really, including the ground crews, 7 days a week, and I never heard of any complaints. And there was an awful lot of work to be done, not only just refueling and rearming, but repairing too. I mean, those statistics which I gave you, which actually amazed me when I looked at them, I came across them. This ridiculous book of mine was actually drafted in 1960, after 13 years of working with Lord Beaverbrook. He decided that one of us had to go and he was going to stay. And I sort of was wondering what the hell to do, because then, as now, jobs don't grow on trees for 40-year-olds. And I thought, well, I'll sit down. I've got this great box. I had a huge cardboard box which was absolutely full of letters and diaries and papers and scraps of paper which I'd scribbled on during the war and so on. And I thought, well, I'm going to write all this down, and and when the telephone rings, it'll ring, and this will be for my children and grandchildren if I ever have any. And then the telephone rang on about the 18th of December, and I'd only got to October 1944, and the whole lot went up to the attic and stayed there for 26 years. And then came down again, and one or two people had a look at it and said, well, you ought to really knock it into shape and see whether somebody won't publish it. But of course it wasn't finished. And although I'd got some papers relating to the end of the war, I had to go to our Ministry Historical Branch and get out the wing log. And there were all these astonishing facts, which I hadn't got my own logbook. Somewhere along the line that had gone west. And so I had to go to the wing log. And there were these extraordinary facts. I mean, I suppose we started off on the 9th of April when the Seigneur was crossing with 5 squadrons. We must have had between 90 and 100 aeroplanes, I suppose, and probably between 90 and 100 pilots. And in 19 days, we lost more than 100 aeroplanes, which were either completely destroyed or destroyed beyond our own repair. And I could hardly believe this. And unusually, I'd written in my own handwriting quite a long thing, a sort of summary. It was really my last proper thing of the war, about the wing, and ended up by saying, fortunately, our losses were not severe. But I did think, when the Gulf War was going on, that when you heard the uproar when 1 or 2 aeroplanes got destroyed, but as somebody said to me, or perhaps it was you at dinner, there were 60 of these aeroplanes, and we lost 5 or 6. So that's 10%, isn't it? But we actually lost 100 in 3 weeks, and I could hardly believe it, but it's true. It was black and white. Don't think I can have invented it, and anyway, that bit of it wasn't written by me.
It must have been very difficult, sir, to have pushed on at that time when seemingly the war had very nearly been won. I mean, how on earth did you manage to get everyone pulling together? There must have been a reluctance.
There was a tremendous desire to get it over and done with. Everybody was half mad, I think, actually. You know, we'd been slogging away for bloody years, some of us, and everybody had been, not everybody in the wing, because there was quite a big turnover, but we were very proud of ourselves. We really thought that we were better than anybody else, and that we thought that we were the best close support unit in the world, leave alone the Royal Air Force. And on the day of when we were crossing the Senio, we were actually asked to strafe the north bank of the Senio when our own people were dug into the south bank, and the river wasn't much broader than this room. You know, we were very, very proud of ourselves, and which I'm not ashamed of. We thought we were very good, and we were determined that we were going to somehow see this thing through, and that's what did it. But you were quite right. One had somewhere near the front of one's mind all the time that if you just stayed alive for another fortnight after all these years, the whistle was going to blow.
Can I ask you something which concerns us a lot, perhaps overly in peacetime, is a thing called discipline, I suppose, is the word I'd put it under. And again, I come back to your book. I know you keep talking about this wretched book, but it's fascinating what you talk about. And 2 things in that book that are interesting on this level. One is drink, alcohol. You talk a lot about alcohol, and you're honest enough at one stage, I think, to say that you actually spoke to your wing commander spoke to you about alcohol, and you talk about finding solace in alcohol because of the fear of flying and the problems of that. And the other one is a very entertaining story you tell when, and I can't remember exactly when it was, but you were being visited by, I think, the AOC, and you stood there on the parade ground, and your hair was blowing all over your face, and you were in a tunic, and you wore sort of your trousers inside out so the beer stains wouldn't show from the previous night, and so on. And immediately after the inspection, you both disappeared as quickly as you could so you wouldn't be found out. Now, they're sort of issues that we sometimes get rather concerned about in peacetime. Maybe war, I don't know, I've not experienced war, but we do debate those sort of things in peacetime. And you talk about them a lot in your book. I mean, how do you look back on those 2 things now? You know, the pure physical discipline of clean cut and the image you present, perhaps, and the thing about the drink.
Well, I'm awfully sorry about that performance at Crosby on Eden. It really was rather shaming, but it did get me out of the OTU in double quick time. But I have no real excuses for that. And I didn't have my trousers on inside out. That was another occasion. And I mean to say I didn't have my hat on because we were going flying, and you can't go flying in your hat. So, but that's beside the point. But now, actually, discipline was quite good. I mean, it may sound as though it was very lax, but in fact, everybody knew what they'd got to do and how they'd got to behave. And there was a lot of hilarity, thank God. It's very important that there should be. But you could tell a squadron where the thing was even beginning to get out of hand from the squadron where it wasn't. And that really depended again on the boss. And very often, the one where things were worst were where the boss was inclined to be stuffiest. I mean, everybody was terribly young. You know, I mean, the average age in the squadrons I suppose in 1943, 44 was 22, 23. And that would include everybody, squadron command. I mean, I say the average age of pilots. They were very young, and they needed a lot of outlet, so to speak. But they were very strongly disciplined in the air, and with everything to do with flying and fighting and operating, and being on time and keeping their airplanes in good nick and all that sort of thing. Was people might have appeared very lax in other ways, but they were very strict about that. So perhaps I make it sound. I mean, I remember a young friend of mine coming up to me in the street after this book was published and saying, "Good heavens, I never knew we were all pissed all the time." Well, I thought that was carrying things a bit far, actually. But, we weren't. Not all the time. No.
So Hugh, in your introductory comments, and again in discussion, you drew a fairly firm distinction between the two positions of wing leader and wing commanding officer, although you were obviously filling both for quite some time. Would you care to elaborate on the responsibilities of each? And when in your commanding officer position, were you in fact forced to take a significant back seat, so to speak, as far as the flying was concerned?
Well, each wing, as you know, had a group captain and a wing commander flying, a wing who was always referred to as the wing leader, and whose responsibility really was the organization of the flying operations of the wing. And most of my time, from the end of 1943 until October 1944, was in that capacity. And most of that time also, I had group captains who had been distinguished fighter pilots. I mean, Sheep Gilroy was one, Brian Kinkham. But on the whole, they didn't do a great deal of flying. They left it to me. The wing needed quite a lot of organizing. We were on the move all the time. We had a large maintenance unit as well as the maintenance that was done in the squadrons. It required a hand of an administrative hand and leadership, which was important. But I used to find that most of the better wings were commanded by group captains who flew just regularly enough to be seen to be flying and to be capable of flying and to be leading, but not to be usurping the job of wing leader. And I think that was quite important, because everybody in that environment was very much together. I mean, we were all together on a strip, usually just a bulldoze strip with 4 or 5 squadrons dispersed around it, and everybody living in tents with squadron tent messes, and everybody knew everybody else. And I think that the better wings, the more successful ones, normally were ones where the CO as well as the wing commander took a part in operations, but didn't take a sort of overwhelming part. My own situation was one really where most of the time that I was wing CO during the period before the war ended, I didn't have a wing leader. But in any case, I'm bound to say that I would have felt that it was absolutely essential for me to be seen to be flying from time to time. And indeed, one saw that in other. I mean, for instance, Basil Embry, when he was an Air Vice Marshal, used to fly fairly regularly on operations with his squadrons or with his wings. Certainly David Ashley did. Don Bennett, of course, did regularly. I think myself that it was desirable that young senior field air officers who were commanding people who were being asked to do something quite difficult and dangerous should be seen to be able and willing to do it themselves. But they had other things to do as well, and they shouldn't ignore those.
How do you view the Air Force today when you sort of look back and you watch all the press and you see all the cutbacks and things like that? How do you look from afar now and sort of look back to the way we're going to go in the future? Do you look back with some, I don't think you wish you were there, or do you look back with some dismay perhaps, or what?
Absolutely no dismay. No, I mean I'm always terribly proud of everything I see in the service, and that's not just thank you for a good dinner. I mean I am, but I have been lucky enough to keep in touch with the service to some extent, mainly through the RAF Benevolent Fund, which I was on the Finance and General Purposes Committee of for a long time, and that sort of gave me a constant contact. No, I don't feel the least dismayed, and then one sees what incredible things the service is capable of doing. I mean, the Falklands and the Gulf made one tremendously proud of having been in the Royal Air Force. I'm pretty amazed, really, when I hear how old you all are and how young you all look. I think that's a bit unfair, but but that's another matter.
So Hugh, I see a thread running to your conversation there, and perhaps I put this to you as a proposition that you think about when I develop my next theme. I would suggest that a leader is someone you would wish to follow. And then whilst you think about whether you agree with that or not, perhaps I could develop onto the Royal Auxiliary Air Force, which you came from, and I know you were just mentioning Chief Gilroy. I know he comes from there, since I've just come from Edinburgh myself and know him well. We're going back possibly to an era of growing importance to the Royal Auxiliary Air Force. Is this the right way to go, and are we going to get the right calibre of men coming back in that way in those times?
Well, I do hope so. I mean, I think that it's been rather sad and not to the advantage of the service that for quite a long time it didn't have that civilian volunteer arm like such as exists in the Territorial Army and such as did exist with the Auxiliary Air Force. And I am delighted that the Auxiliary Air Force is now coming back, albeit in a different guise. It was a very hard pill for us all to swallow when they ceased to be flying units. But anybody actually with a grain of sense could understand why that had to be. And so it had to be accepted. But I think it's a very good thing that this link, and particularly a territorial link, with the civilian population in different parts of the country, with the service, is being fostered again, and I'm very, very much in favour of it, and it's continued.
So Hugh, I'm not sure that your audience are going to stop asking questions, and you show no signs of stopping answering them. So to use a boxing simile, I think I should step in to save you from further punishment.
Thank you very much.
And we should adjourn to the bar. There's one quality in a leader which you didn't choose to mention, but which I think is absolutely essential and which you've shown in abundance this evening, and that's a rare good humour. I think a sense of humour is absolutely essential. And clearly you've not lost yours. I think it's also true to say, despite your efforts at self-deprecation, that in the short time that we've been together, I suspect that everybody like me will have understood very well why you achieved what you did, both during the war and subsequently. It's been a great privilege for us to have you along here this evening to share your thoughts and to dip into that private box of yours and not only examine the memories in private, but to share them with us. And we're most grateful to you for doing that and for giving us some thoughts on leadership in war and leadership in general. Because although you said it can't be learnt, and we talked about this in the interval, I think everybody here, and I mean everybody, all of us, need to try to understand what makes good leaders and to try to learn and then to put that learning into practice. And you've undoubtedly helped us this evening, and I'm most grateful to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you, sir. Very kind.
Thank you. Now let's go and have another.